A party of horsemen started from Richmond with the intention of killing every colored person they saw in Southampton County. They stopped outside the cabin of a free colored man who was hoeing in his little field. They called out, "Is this Southampton County?" He replied, "Yes, sir. You've just crossed the line by yonder tree." They shot him dead and rode on.
They killed Antonio, a slave of Mr. J. Stanley, whom they shot. Then they pointed their guns at him and told him to confess about the insurrection. He told them he didn't know anything about any insurrection. They shot several balls through him, quartered him, and put his head on a pole at the fork of the road leading to the court. He had no trial. They never do.
Although Virginia, in many ways, had long been among the more lenient of slave states with regard to treatment of slaves, in 1831, many white citizens of that state took up arms and went on a murderous rampage. What could have driven Virginia's white population to such a frenzy of terror and rage?
It is with pain that we speak of another feature of the Southampton Rebellion, for we have been most unwilling to have our sympathies for the sufferers diminished or affected by their misconduct. We allude to the slaughter of many blacks without trial and under circumstances of great barbarity. We met with an individual of intelligence who told us that he himself had killed between 10 and 15.
This insurrection, this Southampton Rebellion, was led by a man his followers called General Nat, and is generally considered the most successful slave rebellion in the United States, if one measures success by the number of casualties among the whites. Like all slave revolts within the U.S., both before and after the states separated from Britain to form their own nation, the revolt led by Nat Turner would end in failure. But the terror created by Turner's small army did not disappear with their deaths, or the deaths of countless innocent slaves and free blacks. The slaughters both by and of slaves would horrify the nation and pull it one step further up from slavery.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 was by no means the first significant revolt by slaves in America. As many as 500 rebellions, large and small, have been identified over the centuries of America's practice of slavery. In no case did the slaves achieve any kind of overthrow of white power, and in almost all cases, the participating slaves, and frequently many others as well, were executed or faced some other harsh penalty. Although we imagine slave uprisings taking place on southern plantations, one of the earliest significant slave revolts occurred not in the South, but in the colony of New York. In 1712, New York City had a relatively large population of slaves. Additionally, large numbers of escaped slaves in the New York colony had made their way to the city, where many joined together in criminal gangs. There were numerous such gangs around the docks, and they frequently clashed violently. White New Yorkers were terrified by these groups, though generally the gangs did not attack whites. Regardless, the white population was already concerned. Since 1702, it had been illegal for slaves to gather in groups larger than 3, Despite these regulations, and despite paid enforcers who flogged violators, slaves in New York City had more opportunities for communication than those on plantations. And in 1712, communication led to conspiracy. On the night of April 6th, a group of 24 African-born slaves gathered together in an orchard on the edge of town. Here they had hidden muskets, hatchets, and swords, which they now took to hand. They set fire to a building and then hid themselves and waited. When the white townsmen showed up to fight the blaze, the slaves opened fire, killing 9 men. An alarm was raised, and the slaves ran off. Militia from the city and Westchester County gathered to hunt the Africans down and eventually surrounded them in the woods of northern Manhattan. 6 of the rebels, probably the leaders, committed suicide. 70 black men, more than actually participated in the uprising, were jailed. Eventually, 27 were tried, and 21 were convicted and executed in a grisly manner. Some were burned alive. At least one was killed on a breaking wheel. The white colonists of New York reacted with even more stringent laws, restricting the movement of slaves and free blacks. Any slave caught with a firearm would receive 20 lashes. Conspiracy by a slave to commit murder was punishable by death, as was rape and destruction of property. South Carolina did not have problems quite as early as New York, in part because the slave owners and their slaves had come from the sugar plantations of the West Indies, and they brought the restrictive slave codes with them. But in 1739, South Carolina's planters faced an armed insurrection. The leader of the rebellion was a slave named Jemmy, who was identified as being from Angola, but was probably from the Congo Empire. The Congo had been going through civil wars for years at the time that Jemmy and his compatriots would have been captured and enslaved. This meant that he and his men would likely have had military experience. Jemmy was slaved on a plantation near the Stono River, about 20 miles southwest of Charleston, South Carolina. On September 9th, 1739, he and 20 other African slaves made an attempt to leave South Carolina for Spanish Florida. England and Spain were at war, and the Spanish sought to destabilize the British colonies and let it be known that slaves who escaped to Florida would be freed and given land. Some slaves had already taken advantage of this offer. The Congo Empire had been Catholic since 1491 and included a large number of Portuguese speakers. Jemmy and his fellow Congo slaves would likely have been attracted to living in a Catholic land and would have had familiarity with the Spanish language. Spain's incentive would have been particularly attractive to them. The timing of their attempt was probably due to South Carolina's Security Act, which would have been enacted at the end of the month. That law would require all white men to carry firearms with them at all times, including Sunday church. On Sundays, slaves were allowed to work for themselves, and white men typically did not go armed. Jemmy and his men were probably intending to take advantage of that fact before the law changed things. They first attacked a shop at the Stono River Bridge, where they killed 2 shopkeepers and seized guns and ammunition. They continued south, killing white men, women, and children along the way. One tavern keeper was spared because he had a reputation for kindness towards his slaves. Another slave owner was spared when his slaves hid him from Jemmy's men. Those slaves were forced to join the insurrection, but they were eventually rewarded for their efforts to save their master. Other slaves joined the march south, and the slave army had 50 men by late morning. Lieutenant Governor William Bull almost became one of their victims. He later reported the incident to the English Board of Trade.
I was returning from Granville County with 4 gentlemen and met these rebels at 11 o'clock in the forenoon, and fortunately discerned the approaching danger time enough to avoid it, and to give notice to the militia, who on the occasion behaved with so much expedition and bravery, as by 4 o'clock the same day to come up with them, and killed and took so many as put a stop to any further mischief at that time.
When the militia arrived, they faced an army of as many as 80 rebels. The two armed groups clashed. 20 whites and 44 slaves were killed in the firefight. The rest of the slaves escaped, though most were captured in the months that followed. Again, Lieutenant Governor William Bull.
44 of them have been killed and executed. Some few yet remain concealed in the woods, expecting the same fate. They seem desperate. It was the opinion of His Majesty's Council that one of the most effectual means that could be used at present to prevent such desertion of our Negroes is to encourage some Indians, by a suitable reward, to pursue and, if possible, to bring back the deserters. And while the Indians are thus employed, they would be in the way ready to intercept others that might attempt to follow. I have sent for the chiefs of the Chickasaws living at New Windsor and the Catawba Indians for that purpose.
The colonial government responded to the insurrection by passing an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes and other slaves in 1740. Slaves were prohibited from growing their own food, learning to read, earning their own money, or meeting in groups. Some of these regulations had existed previously, but had not been enforced. The South Carolina legislature also sought to address potential causes of the rebellion by setting penalties for masters who were brutal with their slaves or who worked them excessively. Consider that excessive work meant more than 15 hours of work per day in the summer, or 14 hours of work per day in the winter. What could inspire slaves to take up arms against overwhelming odds, facing a certain and horrific death if they failed? Perhaps these rebellions in 1712 and 1739 are more understandable, given that colonies themselves were less organized and united than they would be after 1787. But surely slaves considering armed rebellion in the early 19th century would have known their cause was hopeless. The Haitian Revolution would change everything about what was possible for slaves who were willing to fight for their freedom. Although this revolt obviously did not occur within the United States, it was too close for comfort in the eyes of many. The effects of the Haitian Revolution would spill over into the United States. Known then as the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the island that would become Haiti was producing 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of the French and British imported sugar in 1789. The wealthy colony was built on the backs of African slaves, who outnumbered whites and free blacks 10 to 1. In August 1791, those slaves, inspired by the French Revolution, rose up in rebellion. Before the end of the year, they killed 4,000 whites and burned hundreds of plantations. Over the next several years, the Saint-Domingue rebellion expanded into a full civil war against France. Finally, in 1804, Haiti achieved independence. The oppressed had become the new ruling class. A colony of slaves had liberated itself from European rule. slave owners in America were made all the more fearful by the revolution's success. They worried that their own slaves might be inspired by the success of African slaves in Haiti. And indeed they would be. Haiti stood as irrefutable proof that an armed revolt by an enslaved population could lift an entire population out of slavery. Thomas Jefferson, who was president during the end of this tumultuous period, was concerned about the example Haiti had set. But the Haitian Revolution also made possible the greatest achievement of the Jefferson administration, the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon's failure to subdue Haiti led to his decision to sell the massive French lands bordering the United States, lands that would later lead to expanded conflict over slavery. One of the African-American revolutionaries, who Jefferson feared had been inspired by the Haitian Revolution, was Gabriel, slave of the Prosser family in Virginia's Henrico County. Born in the year that Thomas Jefferson penned the nation's Declaration of Independence, by 1800, Gabriel was a giant of a man. Standing at 6 feet 3 inches, Gabriel carried the muscles that came from training as a blacksmith since he was 10 years old. Because of Gabriel's smithing skills, his master hired Gabriel out to other planters and merchants. Prosser also allowed Gabriel to hire himself out on Sundays, which gave him a chance to earn money. It also allowed him to meet with slaves and disaffected free blacks. The energy of America's own revolutionary generation, the success of the slaves in Saint-Domingue in throwing off their oppressors, and the countless indignities and injuries that surrounded his life as a slave fueled in Gabriel a desire to take up arms in the name of liberty. In the summer of 1800, Gabriel and his brothers Solomon and Martin held secret meetings with groups of other slaves. Writing half a century later, the abolitionist Thomas Wentworth Higginson described a meeting.
The Negro Ben Woolfolk stated that about the 1st of the preceding June, a Negro named Colonel George prevailed on him to have an interview with a certain leading man among the blacks named Gabriel. Arrived at the place of meeting, he found many persons assembled, to whom a preliminary oath was administered that they would keep secret all which they might hear. The leaders then began, to the dismay of this witness, to allude to a plan of insurrection, which, as they stated, was already far advanced toward maturity. Presently, a man named Martin, Gabriel's brother, proposed religious services, caused the company to be duly seated, and began an impassioned exposition of Scripture, bearing upon the perilous theme. The Israelites were glowingly portrayed as a type of successful resistance to tyranny, and it was argued that now, as then, God would stretch forth his arm to save, and would strengthen 100 to overthrow 1,000.
Gabriel had previously purchased arms and ammunition, including guns, shot, and powder. Gabriel and his brother Solomon used their blacksmith skills to turn scythes into swords. One witness reported, after viewing the swords, "I have never seen arms so murderous." Gabriel's plan was stunning in its audacity. They would strike on the first day of September. Over 1,000 men were to assemble at a brook near Richmond and then march on the city in 3 columns. Higginson reports,
The right wing was instantly to seize upon the penitentiary building, just converted into an arsenal, while the left wing was to take possession of the powder house. These 2 columns were to be armed chiefly with clubs, as their undertaking depended for success upon surprise, and was expected to prevail without hard fighting. But it was the central force, armed with muskets, cutlasses, knives, and pikes, upon which the chief responsibility rested. These men were to enter the town at both ends simultaneously and begin a general carnage.
A letter writer reported weeks after the plot.
It was extensive and vast in its design. Nothing could have been better contrived. They were then to have called on their fellow Negroes and the friends of humanity throughout the continent by proclamation to rally round their standard. The magazine, which was defenseless, would have supplied them with arms for many thousand men. The treasury would have given them money, the mills bread, and the bridges would have enabled them to let in their friends and keep out their enemies.
Gabriel's plan was derailed when instead of an army, an incredible storm was unleashed upon Richmond, submerging roads and plantations and washing away bridges. Higginson reports,
The fords, which then, as now, were the frequent substitutes for bridges in that region, were rendered wholly impassable. The brook swamp, one of the most important strategic points of the insurgents, was entirely inundated, hopelessly dividing Prosser's farm from Richmond. The country Negroes could not get in, nor those from the city get out. The 1,000 men dwindled to a few hundred, and these half paralyzed by superstition. There was nothing to do but to dismiss them, and before they could reassemble, they were betrayed.
2 slaves came forward and reported Gabriel's plans to their master. He then contacted Virginia's Governor James Monroe, who called out the state militia. The city of Richmond was in arms, and night patrols across the state were doubled. A troop of U.S. cavalry was ordered to Richmond, and dozens of slaves were arrested. Gabriel himself escaped for 11 days before being discovered on September 24th as a stowaway on a ship in Norfolk. Taken to Richmond, he was convicted on October 3rd and executed on October 7th. Gabriel's cohorts included slaves, free blacks, and some white workers as well. 1 or more French nationals may have been involved, which drew comparisons to the revolution in Saint-Domingue and had Virginians all the more fearful. Dozens of slaves were executed or sent to the West Indies. One of Gabriel's co-conspirators, a fellow slave, made a speech at his trial.
I have nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have had to offer, had he been taken by the British and put to trial by them. I have adventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, and am a willing sacrifice in their cause. And I beg, as a favor, that I may be immediately led to execution. I know that you have predetermined to shed my blood. Why then all this mockery of a trial?
Governor Monroe sought advice regarding the penalties for the slaves from Thomas Jefferson, who was then vice president. More than 24 slaves had already been executed. Jefferson wrote to Monroe,
Where to stay the hand of the executioner is an important question. Those who have escaped from the immediate danger must have feelings which would dispose them to extend the executions. Even here, where everything has been perfectly tranquil, but where a familiarity with slavery and a possibility of danger from that quarter prepare the general mind for some severities, there is a strong sentiment that there has been hanging enough. The other states and the world at large will forever condemn us if we indulge in a principle of revenge or go one step beyond absolute necessity.
When the executions were over, the legislature responded to the planned rebellion. To reduce the ability of other potential revolutionaries to meet and plan, the Virginia General Assembly outlawed the hiring out of slaves. Additionally, free blacks were required to petition the legislature for permission to remain within Virginia, or else leave the state. Virginia's growing population of free blacks had encouraged slaves to think of freedom for themselves, and Virginia planners could not allow that. Gabriel's plan may have been audacious, but its 1,000-man army never marched. The largest slave revolt in American history took place in the territory that Jefferson was able to purchase from Napoleon after France lost Haiti. Napoleon had hoped to use Louisiana as a base from which to expand into North America. But the loss of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, forced him to change his plans. He sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803. The new governor, William Claiborne, struggled to manage the various French, Spanish, and English-speaking populations, which included wealthy and poor whites, free blacks, African-American slaves, and African slaves. Slave labor was already widely used in Louisiana on sugar, cotton, and indigo plantations. Although they had never had a significant slave revolt, white planters were concerned that the 1791 revolution in the French colony of Saint-Domingue would spread to the French-speaking colony of Louisiana. In January 1811, slaves in New Orleans were enjoying a brief respite in their back-breaking work. The sugar harvest was in, and the slave owners allowed their slaves some freedom so that their masters could focus on the holidays. Charles Delon took advantage of this relaxing of the guard. A trusted slave driver and a slave himself, Delon had the freedom to travel across multiple plantations, ostensibly to work with other slave drivers to plan the harvest and to push slaves to work harder. He used this time to meet secretly with his lieutenants and plan an insurrection. After sundown on January 8th, Delon and about 25 others gathered on the Andre plantation. When Colonel Manuel Andre and his son Gilbert were asleep, the slaves attacked with axes. The slave army marched along the banks of the Mississippi River towards New Orleans. As they marched, they gathered more followers until hundreds of men followed behind Charles Delon and his lieutenants. Contemporary accounts suggest that the army may have swelled to between 200 to as many as 500 rebel slaves. On January 9th, Governor Claiborne, alerted to the impending attack on New Orleans, ordered army troops and militia in the city to march out to meet the rebels. Early on the morning of the 10th, the army troops surrounded the plantation of Jacques Fortier. In a brief battle, Andre's better-armed force shattered the slave army. Delon was captured the next day, January 11th. Unlike Gabriel Prosser, Delon did not get a trial. A witness described Delon's fate at the hands of the militia.
Had his hands chopped off, then shot in one thigh and then the other until they were both broken. Then was shot in the body, and before he had expired, he was put into a bundle of straw and roasted.
Other slaves were arrested and tried. 30 were executed, their heads put on pikes at the city gates. Almost 100 rebels in all were killed, either in battle or in the executions. Bodies of the dead rebels were displayed by planters and government officials, much as the Romans had lined their roads with the crucified army of Spartacus, a warning to all slaves who dreamed of freedom. But that dream was not easily suppressed. Denmark Vesey was a slave who achieved that dream for himself. But it was then replaced by a new dream of freedom for his fellow Africans and African Americans who were suffering under the yoke of slavery. A skilled carpenter, Vesey settled in Charleston to ply his trade. He became a respected member of the free black community in Charleston. But he was an angry man, and he went to the Christian Bible to find justification for his rage. Abolitionist Thomas Higginson reported that
he rendered himself perfectly familiar with all those parts of the scriptures which he thought he could pervert to his purpose, and would readily quote them to prove that slavery was contrary to the laws of God. that slaves were bound to attempt their emancipation, however shocking and bloody might be the consequences, and that such efforts would not only be pleasing to the Almighty, but they were absolutely enjoined, and their success predicted in the Scriptures.
Vesey taught Bible lessons and preached sermons at Charleston's African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he used that venue as a means of gathering and organizing his followers. Literate and well-spoken, he drew a crowd of loyal followers. In addition to the Bible, Vesey drew inspiration from the Haitian Revolution. He even wrote to the government in Haiti to request assistance and planned to escape to Haiti if all went wrong. His own revolution was planned for a Sunday in July 1822. It was customary for large numbers of slaves working plantations in the country to enter Charleston on Sundays, the one day of the week that they had to themselves. Entire plantations of slaves were expected to remain in the city that evening, hidden away by blacks living in town. After seizing control of the city, Vesey's plan seems to have been to load his people into ships and sail for Haiti. Vesey insisted on keeping a tight control on information. He especially did not want house slaves to be brought in until the last moment, for these slaves often developed real and shared affection for their masters and those families. Unfortunately for him, this warning proved prophetic. One of his confederates, William Paul, had trusted a house slave who then reported what he'd heard to his master. The master then shared the information with Charleston's mayor. Enough information was gathered that the state militia was called in to reinforce the city guard, but no general alarm was raised. Vesey recognized that the increased guard meant that he had been betrayed. He called off the uprising, but within a week, most of the leaders were arrested. Eventually, over 130 men were charged, 67 convicted, and 35, including Vesey, were hanged for conspiracy. Vesey's was the greatest slave revolt that never happened. Denmark Vesey might have been a preacher, but Nat Turner was a prophet. Gabriel's plot may have been the most audacious, Denmark's the most well-planned, but if measured in terms of deaths among the ruling class, Nat Turner's rebellion was the most successful by far. Born in Southampton County, Virginia, on October 2nd, 1800, the week before Gabriel was hanged, Nat Turner was marked for destiny. His mother and father told him that birthmarks on his head and chest indicated that he was meant for greatness. Like Vesey, Nat was extremely religious. He made a practice of fasting and prayer and reading the Bible. He believed he heard spirits talking to him, and he listened. Once he ran away from his master and was gone for a month. He felt commanded by the Spirit to return, and did so. He grew to believe that his destiny was not to achieve freedom simply for himself, but for his fellow slaves. Though his masters were not unusually cruel, Nat Turner experienced the outrages to personal life that affected many slaves. His wife and children were sold away to another plantation. Twice he asked his masters to free him, and both times he was whipped for his insolence. These offenses and indignities wore away at him. He began to interpret his visions as a calling for him to take up arms against the white man. He had a vision of white and black spirits clashing and heard the Holy Spirit direct him to take action.
I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and a spirit instantly appeared to me and said the serpent was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men. and that I should take it on and fight against the serpent, for the time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first. And by signs in the heavens it would make known to me when I should commence the great work. And until the first sign appeared, I should conceal it from the knowledge of men.
In February 1831, an eclipse of the sun was taken as his sign to act.
And immediately, on the signs appearing in the heavens, the seal was removed from my lips. And I communicated the great work laid out for me to the four whom I had the greatest confidence: Henry, Hark, Nelson, and Sam.
On the evening of August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner and those four, plus Will Francis and Jack Reese, began the killing. They started at the home of Joseph Travis, Nat's own master.
Hark got a ladder and set it against the chimney, on which I ascended, and hoisting a window, entered and came down the stairs, unbarred the door, and removed the guns from their places. It was then I observed that I must spill the first blood. On which, armed with a hatchet and accompanied by Will, I entered my master's chamber. It being dark, I could not give the death blow. The hatchet glanced from his head. He sprang from his bed and called his wife. It was his last word. Will laid him dead with a blow of his axe, and Miss Travis shared the same fate as she lay in bed.
From there, they began working their way through other homesteads, headed toward the closest town, Jerusalem, killing all whites and being joined by additional slaves.
I determined on starting for Jerusalem. Our number amounted now to 50 or 60, all mounted and armed with guns, axes, swords, and clubs.
By late Monday morning, word of the rebellion had spread. Outside the Parker home, Turner and his men were confronted by a group of militia. They shot Hark's horse out from under him and wounded half a dozen slaves. Turner's army fell apart as they escaped. Later that day, Nat was able to gather up more men, but again they met armed resistance and lost. Most of his men were either immediately killed or captured, but Nat Turner himself was able to escape for a while. Nat Turner was captured on October 30th, tried on November 5th, and hanged and then skinned on November 11th. The backlash against Nat Turner's bloody rebellion, in which around 60 white men, women, and children were murdered, led to the slaughter of as many as 200 slaves and free blacks, not counting the almost 60 conspirators who were also executed. The Virginia General Assembly debated how to respond to the Turner Rebellion. Many wanted to abolish slavery completely. But that effort failed, and the legislature chose instead to enforce ever tighter restrictions. It was made a crime punishable by a year in jail simply to express the opinion that masters had no rights to their slaves. Given the religious nature of Nat Turner's rebellion, and Denmark Vesey's, and Gabriel's as well, the legislature also declared that no slave or free black would be allowed to preach. Beyond the changes in the laws, there was a change in the atmosphere. No longer could Virginians fool themselves into thinking that the seemingly docile nature of their slaves meant that they accepted their lot in life. Even formerly loved and trusted house slaves were seen as the potential killers of the master's wife and children. The days of slaves being able to move freely about at night or on Sundays came to an abrupt end. There would be other significant slave uprisings before 1861. In 1839, Africans illegally enslaved on the slave ship Amistad would overthrow their own crew and eventually be returned to freedom and Africa by order of the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1842, 25 slaves held by the Cherokee Nation revolted and headed for Mexico, which had outlawed slavery. Though they killed 2 pursuers, they were eventually recaptured. But these and other smaller rebellions did not affect Southern American laws and philosophy in the way that Nat Turner's bloody uprising did. In 1831, in the wake of the deadliest slave revolt in the history of the United States, the nation was just 1 generation away from its deadliest war. A war that would pit brother against brother, master against servant, North against South. A war that would prove the final rung on the ladder up from slavery.